Zinnanti. I'm the lead pastor at Victory Church in Sharon, Massachusetts. And I want to thank you for taking the opportunity to check out our church online. Victory Church exists to show people the love of God and to connect people to Him. That's what we're all about. I hope that as you check out this teaching message, that it'll really impact your life and help you grow in the Lord and connect to Him in a greater way. Have a great day.
So that's fine. You know, there was a young woman who wrote a letter to her ex-fiance. And it read this. It said, "Dearest Jimmy, no words could ever express the great unhappiness I felt since breaking our engagement." She said, "Please say that you'll take me back. No one could ever replace you in my heart. Please forgive me. I love you. I love you. I love you. Marie." P.S. Congratulations on winning the state lottery. This morning we're starting a new teaching series entitled The One Another's. You know, there are several places in the New Testament where Jesus or the apostles instruct us to do things for one another. I call these the one another's. For example, in Romans chapter 12, verse 10, the Bible tells us to be devoted to one another and to honor one another. In Romans chapter 12, it goes on and it says to live in harmony with one another. In Romans 15, it says to accept one another. Ephesians 4:32 says to be kind to one another. And James, in chapter 5, told us to pray for one another. So there are many other instances in the scriptures where the one another instructions are as well. And there are some of these instructions, though, that are given over and over and over in the New Testament. And the New Testament writers tell us to do them for one another over and over and over again. The fact that they tell us over and over shows us the stress that is on us to make sure that we do these things. Over the next 4 weeks, we're going to examine the four most prevalent one another's in the New Testament. And so the title of my message this morning is Love One Another. Love one another. There are four scriptures that I want us to look at today as we consider the importance of loving one another and the difference that makes in our spiritual lives. And so the first thing that I want you to understand about loving one another today is that loving one another is a result of salvation. 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 22, it says this. I'll read from here. "Now that you have purified yourselves by obeying the truth, so that you have sincere love for your brothers, love one another deeply from the heart." I like this. Let me read it one more time. "Now that you have purified yourselves by obeying the truth, so that you have a sincere heart, sincere love for your brothers, love one another from the heart." Peter says that we purify ourselves by obeying the truth. What he's talking about here is he's talking about salvation. This is our salvation experience. You become pure through the surrender and obedience to Christ, who is the truth. And he goes on and he says this, "So now you have a sincere love for your brothers." Where did that sincere love come from? It came from our salvation. Does that mean that before we got saved, that we really didn't know what a sincere love was? Pretty much. That's exactly what he said. He's implying here, and listen, I remember in the 1980s, there was a song that said, I want to know what love is. I want you to show me. I don't know if you remember that song. Before I knew God, I didn't know what love was. Without experiencing the love of God for myself, I had no way to determine if what I felt about love was genuine or not. And I want you to know, I'll never forget the first time that a girlfriend I had told me that she loved me. Junior high school. 7th grade. I'm not going to tell you her name, because I might be friends with her on Facebook. But I remember we were in the hall, and she looked up into my eyes, and she said, I love you. And then she looked at me longingly for the response, And I didn't know what to do. Because I had no idea if I loved her or not. I didn't know what love was. And I remember her just standing there looking at me, waiting for this response. And I remember thinking to myself, well, when she comes around me, my heart does, one of these deals, so maybe I do love her. Oh, I must be it. I must love her. So I looked back at her and went, I love you too. And she hugged me, and I remember walking down the hall with her and thinking, I just avoided an argument, I think. I already knew that much about relationships. Broke up with her the next week to go out with Paige, but In our society, listen, we don't understand what love is. In fact, we use the term love, and we just throw it around. Think about this. In the English language, the word love is just so overused. We go, man, I love my new car, right? Oh, I love Chinese food. We're going to Chinese out. I love Chinese takeout. Yes. My wife, I love my dog. Oh, my dog, you're so dog. That dog gets more of my affection than I am. Listen, if all of the words have the same meaning, our wives are getting the short end of the stick. Because I turn around and go, she says, I love my dog. And then she turns around and goes, I love you, Lou. I'm like, oh, okay. You see, before you experience God's love, you don't have a proper definition or even a true understanding of what real love is all about. You see, love is unconditional love. It's about everything that I am is for that other person. But thank God for his transforming nature of love. Because once you experience God's love, then you have something to measure the way that you're loving other people against. Our goal should be that we love others the way that Jesus loved others. So Peter says this, he goes on and he says this, so now you're saved so that you can have a sincere love for the brothers. He then says this, he says, so love one another deeply from the heart. In essence, what he's saying is this, he's saying, since you've been saved to love others. That's what he's saying. Since in your regenerated nature, since it's now in your regenerated nature to love, then do it. Paul then qualifies how we're supposed to love. He says that we're supposed to love each other deeply and from the heart. I like that. The idea, the word deeply conveys intensity. You don't just love one another. Hey, yo, what's up? Love you, man. That's not love. We love each other with intensity from deep within us. He goes in and he says, not only do we love each other with intensity, but we also love each other from the heart. That word from the heart conveys that love that comes from within. We don't just love one another externally or shallowly, but from a profound affection for one another that emanates from deep within us. We love with the love that God put inside of us. The second thing that I want you to see about loving one another is that loving one another completes the law. Think about this. Romans chapter 13, verses 8 and 9 says this. Paul wrote this, and he said, let no debt remain outstanding, except the continuing debt to love one another. For he who loves his fellow man has fulfilled the law and the commandments. The commandments: do not commit adultery, do not murder, do not steal, do not covet, and whatever other commandment there may be are summed up in this one rule: love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no harm to its neighbor, therefore love is the fulfillment of the law. That's what Paul said. Love is the fulfillment. If you love others, you're fulfilling the law of God. Do you know that there's 613 commandments in the Old Testament? In Matthew chapter 22, verses 37 through 40, when Jesus was asked about which commandment was the most important, he said this. Jesus responded, he said, love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, and with all of your minds. This is the first and the greatest commandment. And the second is just like it. He said, love your neighbor as yourself. And all of the law and all the prophets hang on these two commandments. Jesus said all of the commandments boil down to these two things, loving God and loving others. Let's consider for a minute the 10 commandments, okay? First of all, you shall have no other gods before me. Which is that? That's, I would say, loving God. You shall not make any false idols. Loving God. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. Loving God. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. Which one? Loving God. But watch this. Honor your father and your mother. Loving others. You shall not murder. Loving others. You shall not commit adultery. Loving others. You shall not steal. Loving others. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. Loving others. You shall not covet. Loving others. So you see that Jesus said that the first and the greatest commandment was to love God with all your heart and all your soul. But in the 10 commandments, there's only 4 commandments that are given that stress loving God. And there's 6 commandments that stress how we love one another. What that tells me is that though loving God is first and foremost, the way that we love one another is of great importance to God as well. And Paul stressed the fact that many of the commandments were given to help us to love one another. And therefore, if you love one another, you're actually fulfilling God's will. The third thing that I want you to understand about loving one another is that loving one another demonstrates God's existence. Okay, watch this. This is so awesome. 1 John chapter 4, verses 11 through 12, it says this, Dear friends, since God so loved us, we also ought to love one another. No one has ever seen God. Nobody's seen God. But if we love one another, God lives in us, and his love is made complete in us. What John is saying here is that although no one has ever seen God, if we love one another, God's love will be seen through us. And thus people have a vision of who God is. God is not just a loving God. In fact, the Bible says that God is love. All that we know about love is rooted in the character and the nature of Almighty God. God and love are intertwined. You can't separate them. There's a movie, I don't know if some of you saw it, maybe it was several years ago, it was entitled To End All Wars. And it was based on a book by Ernest Gordon. And it tells a story of in World War II, how these Scottish prisoners of war, they were captured by the Japanese. And they were forced by their Japanese captors to labor on a jungle railroad. It tells how these men had been denigrated to barbarous behavior. In fact, to the point where all they cared about was themselves, each and every one of them. And they were hurting each other, and they were despising each other, and being so selfish that they would literally, at other people's expense, take everything for themselves. The book tells it like this, that something happened one afternoon. And it says this, that as they were coming back from the work detail, that there was a shovel missing from the number of shovels that they had given out that morning. And so the Japanese, as the soldiers were coming back, the Japanese would count up every one of the shovels. And they came up, and there was one shovel missing at the first checkpoint. And so the commander, the Japanese commander, came out, and he had all of the prisoners lined up there in front of him. And he said, he demanded that the missing shovel would be produced at once, or else. When nobody in the squadron budged, the officer got his gun, and he threatened to kill them all on the spot. He said, either produce the shovel, or I'm going to kill you all right now. It was obvious that the officer meant it. And all of a sudden, one of the men stepped out of the line. He came forward. The officer put his gun away, and he picked up a shovel, and he beat that man to death. When it was over, the other survivors picked up the bloody corpse and carried it with them to the second tool shed. This time, when they counted the shovels, there was no shovel missing. In fact, they had miscounted at the first check. The word spread like wildfire through the camp. That an innocent man had been willing to give up his life in order to save the lives of men who didn't even care about it. Well, that incident had a profound effect the men began to treat each other like brothers. And when the Allies swept in and liberated the captive soldiers, and took captive they liberated the captive soldiers and they took captive the Japanese soldiers. What happened was these men, as they were going to kill the Japanese soldiers, the Allies, the men lined up in front of the Japanese soldiers and said, no more killing. We've had enough. And they turned and forgave the Japanese. You know, many of those Scottish soldiers were atheists and agnostics until that fellow soldier sacrificed himself on their behalf. It was then that they saw that God exists. We want to be like God, don't we? I do. You know, you're never more like God than when you love. The fourth thing that I want you to understand about loving one another is this: that loving one another reflects the character of Christ, reflects the character of Jesus. In John chapter 13, verse 4, the Bible says this, that Jesus got up from the evening meal, and he took off his outer clothing, and he wrapped a towel around his waist, and after that he poured water into a basin, and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with a towel that he wrapped around himself. Now see, they're at the Last Supper. This is the Last Supper, and Jesus, they're eating at the evening dinner. They're having dinner, and Jesus gets up and starts taking off his clothes in front of the disciples. Now, seeing Jesus stripped down to his undergarments probably was not a big deal for the disciples. They've been living together for 3 years. You know, they'd seen the best and the worst of each other all the time. It wasn't no big deal. But the big deal was the fact that the context of where Jesus was getting undressed in front of them was at a Passover meal. At dinner, what's he getting undressed for now? This was totally ununderstood. They didn't understand this. They're at the meal, and he gets up and then it says that he began to pour water into a basin, and he wraps a towel around his waist. And as he does this, all of a sudden the understanding of what Jesus is about to do for them really hit them. Jesus is about to wash our feet. In our society, the significance of the moment escapes us. But the disciples were stunned. You have to understand that the fact that in Jesus' day, think about this, people walked everywhere. They didn't have nice, Toyota Corollas to get into and drive their hoopty down the road. Everybody walked everywhere they went, and most people had sandals for their feet, and many people didn't have any shoes at all. In addition, the streets weren't nice paved streets like we have. They didn't have nice roads to walk on. No, they were dirty, dusty roads. Not only dirty with the dirt and dust of the day, but animals were running everywhere. That means they had to, sidestep bombs everywhere in the road, no matter where they went. Their feet were filthy. And here's the thing, proper hospitality demanded that when somebody came and arrived at your house, that when the owner of the house would have his servant wash that person's foot. If you went to somebody's house and you said, knock on the door, and they wanted to make you feel welcome, the first thing they would do is they'd bring their servant to wash your feet. And that was like saying, you have total freedom to walk through my house. My house is your house. If you knocked on somebody's door and they didn't have their servant come and wash your feet, guess what? Come visit some other day. That's really what they're saying. It's the nice, polite way of letting you know you came at the wrong time. So Jesus, listen, foot washing was the job of the household servant. In the first century culture, the washing of another person's feet, it was the lowliest, most demeaning job that somebody could do. And Jesus adopted the position of a slave when he went around the room and washed his disciples' feet. Jesus wanted the disciples to understand that even though he was their teacher and their Lord, he didn't consider serving them an act of duty. He informed them at that moment that this act of humility and service was the example that they needed to follow in their relationships with one another. And it was just after this act of servanthood that he performed that Jesus tells them in John chapter 13, verses 34 and 35, he says this, "A new commandment I give to you, Love one another as I have loved you, so you must love one another. And by this, all men will know that you are my disciples, because you love one another. See, Jesus provided an object lesson for his disciples of what the true character of love looked like. True biblical love requires action, folks. It requires giving of ourselves to one another. It requires serving one another and taking the position of humility with one another. When you interact with others like that, people will see the character of Christ in your life. St. Francis of Assisi, he said this. He said, preach the word always, and when necessary, use words. Preach the gospel always, and when necessary.
I want to thank you for watching this teaching message that you just watched here on our Victory Church Online. If you have any questions or you have any prayer requests that you would like to share with us, we want you to know that right here on the bottom of your screen you will see an email address and a website, and you can contact us through those means, so that we can be praying for you and we can help you grow a little bit closer to the Lord. God bless you as you continue your journey with Christ.